Hello everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. Bienvenue tout le monde. The talk today will be in English, but we have French interpreters who are available through the web-based platform for the session today. My name is Nathalie Corito. I am the Program Director and Practicum Director for the Interdisciplinary Studies in Sexuality program at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute at Concordia. And I am so pleased to welcome our speakers today. The event today is the result of months of planning and organizing and the incredible hard work of Marlihan Lopez, who I'll introduce in a second, and Kate Burke. It's really exciting to bring everyone together here today for the book launch and for the conversation that's about to happen. Okay, so in keeping with the practices of acknowledging the Indigenous peoples whose territories we occupy through the historic and ongoing project of settler colonialism, we start today's event by giving thanks and acknowledgement to the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, who are recognized as the custodians of the land and waters on which we're gathered today. These are unceded Indigenous lands. Tiohtià:ke, or Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many Indigenous peoples, and is today a home to many Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, including settlers, migrants, immigrants, and the descendants of indentured laborers and slavery. Although we give acknowledgement in connection with past, present, and future relationships with Indigenous peoples, such gestures are made complicated by the ongoing acts of colonization that are embedded in the way our institutions, such as universities and governments, violate Indigenous sovereignty and stewardship. Given the legacy of colonial violence on generations of Indigenous peoples, today's conversation on domestic violence and abolitionist justice may be part of the path towards interrupting the cycles of violence that are woven into the fabric of our institutions and society. This event is co-sponsored by the 12 Days of Action Against Gender-Based Violence. Tomorrow is December 6th, the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women, in commemoration of the Polytechnique massacre that happened on December 6th, 1989, where 14 women were killed. I'd also like to thank our interpreters, including our ASL English interpreter, Tedra Harris, and our English-French interpreters, Nelly Basili and Nabia Yayawi. I'm also trying to remind myself and to remind our speakers to speak slowly so that our interpreters have time to do the work of interpretation. After the event today, our invited guest and the author of the book, Insurgent Love, is going to be signing copies of the book. We're not exactly sure the logistics of where that signing will happen, either in the space or next door at Racine, but we will make sure to announce that information at the end so that you can purchase a copy of the book if you're interested and have it signed. The topic for today's conversation deals with violence and may bring up experiences, memories, and feelings related to your own experiences of violence. We invite you to prioritize your needs if this does come up. For those of you who need additional support directly related to domestic violence, we'll be sharing again at the end resources or information for SOS Violence Conjugale at 1-800-363-9010 and the Sexual Violence Helpline, 1-888-933-9007. And now I'd like to welcome our speakers. So Ardath Whynacht is an activist and writer who works for and with survivors of state and family violence. She teaches sociology at Mount Allison University and lives on unceded Mi'kmaq territory. Marlihan Lopez is a Black feminist community organizer tackling issues surrounding anti-Blackness, gender-based violence, and its intersections. She's currently the EDI Diversity and Inclusion. She coordinated the EDI Diversity and Inclusion for the Quebec Coalition for Rape Crisis Centers, where she did advocacy work on gender, race, class, and ability at the intersection of sexual violence. She's currently the program and outreach coordinator at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute and is also organized with movements such as Black Lives Matter and is the co-founding member of the Coalition to Defund the Police based in Montreal. Nathalie Batraville is an assistant professor at Concordia University's Simone de Beauvoir Institute, where she teaches and conducts research in the areas of Black feminisms, queer theory, and prison abolition. In doing so, she works to generate and illuminate frameworks that challenge state violence and interpersonal violence. And a quick note that anybody who is Natalie's student this semester could come and see her after the talk today in order to pick up their copy of the book. With that, I would like to invite you all to join me in welcoming our speakers and enjoy the conversation that was about to happen.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, everyone, for being here, and thank you, Ardath, for accepting the invitation to launch your book, Insurgent Love, in Montreal in collaboration with the Simone de Beauvoir Institute. I'm so excited to be here participating in this much-needed discussion on transformative justice and gender-based violence. I personally became interested in transformative justice when I worked at the Quebec Coalition of Rape Crisis Centers. The women that I worked with all knew that the criminal justice system wasn't built to protect or repair the harm experienced by survivors. On the contrary, it reproduced it. But the anti-violence movement puts a lot of work and energy into trying to reform it. Having personally experienced both intimate partner violence as well as the violence of policing, I embrace transformative justice as a liberatory approach to responding to harm. So I would like to start by asking you, Ardath, to talk about how you came to this work on transformative justice and how you position yourself doing this work.
Thanks, Marlihan. So I began my career working on family violence and intimate partner violence in 2001. So I was just a baby undergraduate student working as a victim services counselor with Halifax Regional Police. And I was already mistrustful of police going into this position. I was an activist. I'd been pepper sprayed and kettled and that sort of thing. So, I went into it feeling mistrustful of the ways in which police would respond to survivors of family violence. But I came out of about 3 to 4 years in that work firmly convinced that a criminal justice punitive approach to family violence was not effective, and that there had to be better ways to honor and protect those who were living in abusive homes, those who were facing violence. And so around 2007, 2008, I had a request from a warden in the women's prison, the federal women's facility in the Maritimes. And she asked me to come in and run a poetry program. I started working with prisoners in the maximum security unit, mostly women and other gender nonconforming folks, and then later with men serving life sentences. So I kind of got both ends of the spectrum from, those who were living in prisons, some on multiple life sentences for acts of extreme violence, and then also working with those who were looking every day at the failures of the criminal justice system. And so, I became a student of Black feminism, of abolitionist thought. To me, it was not a philosophical position that I intellectually came to. It was because it was the most pragmatic set of ideas that I could find that was reflecting what I was seeing in my work.
Thank you. Let's talk about language. Language has always been an issue within the violence against women movement. Some debate whether we should use the term violence against women or gender-based violence, domestic or intimate partner violence, etc. I want to ask you about your choice of language for the title and throughout your book. You chose to use the term domestic homicide, while a large faction of the violence against women movement has strongly advocated calling every homicide of a woman a femicide. So what led you to use the term domestic homicide? You also talk about family violence. What is at stake for each of these terms?
Yeah, that's a tough question. That was the bulk of the work going into the book, was me trying to sort that out. So femicide is, what advocates say is the killing of women and girls for a gender-related reason. And so there's an international movement for tracking femicides and for collecting better data on the killing of women and girls. And I don't see anything wrong with that movement per se, but from my experience, what I was seeing working in intimate partner violence is that a lot of intimate partner homicides, about half of them include the attempted suicide or successful suicide of the perpetrator. So there are multiple victim crimes, and in about a fifth of intimate partner homicides, you're seeing the death of children, of elders, and in some cases of bystanders. And of course, the Portapique shooting, most recently in Nova Scotia, shows you how much an intimate partner or attempted intimate partner homicide can lead to the deaths of bystanders. And for me, I don't see any utility in excluding victims of those crimes who might not be women. To me, that doesn't help us get at the story of that data. And it's not that we don't need data on how many women and girls are being killed, but often, and this is something that Beth Ritchie has really criticized, are the ways in which the professionalized domestic violence industry kind of tells a story about violence against women and girls as being the result of misogyny. They're like, okay, men hate women, male supremacy, it's patriarchy. And I'm a feminist, and I don't disagree with that. But when the story ends there, what it does is it works to conceal the causes of misogyny, which I argue in the book largely come from settler colonialism, and our men's violence is perpetuated by racial capitalism. So when we only talk about misogyny, and when the conversation ends there, what that also does is it works to conceal the complicity of white feminists in structures of harm, in structures that uphold the very violence that we're seeking to disrupt. And so that's why I move away from talking about femicides, and I'm most interested in intimate violence. But I use the term domestic homicide instead of, say, intimate partner homicide, which is, a more gender-neutral way of looking at intimate severe violence. And I say domestic because if you look at the characteristics of the perpetrators and the type of violence that happens leading up to a homicide, police who perpetrate a large number of homicides and high-risk family violence abusers share similar characteristics, and police are domestic security forces. And if you take a step back and you say, okay, well, let's try to understand violence that comes from the people that are supposed to love and protect us within the home, within families, that's domestic homicide. But within our domestic security forces, we're looking at police as being also perpetrators of homicide.
Is it working? Okay. I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, Marlihan, for inviting me. I had a quick follow-up question about the kind of use of terminology. One of the things that I appreciated in your book is that you also wanted to challenge the conventional ways in which gendered violence is framed by also making clear the extent to which same-gender violence also happens. And so I just wanted to maybe allow you to talk a little bit about that, about the kind of research that you've seen, and why it's important to also highlight that, the heteropatriarchy is maybe a narrow framework in order to help us understand gendered violence more broadly.
Yeah, the data tells us that queer folks and gender non-conforming folks experience intimate partner violence at the same, if not in some cases higher, than heterosexual cisgendered women. And this is data that's been replicated in quite a few places. We have large data sets now, so this is not something that's up for debate. We know that bisexual women and trans women are among the most vulnerable to specific forms of intimate partner violence, and so it's not that in choosing the terminology domestic homicide, it's not about erasing the experience of cisgendered women in dangerous heterosexual relationships, but what it is about is it's like accounting for everyone who's experiencing it and doing away with the ways in which we talk about family violence that, as I mentioned earlier, works to conceal our complicity in structures of power and oppression.
Can I maybe just share a line from your book? You wrote, advocacy movements that argue for gender exclusionary or cis-normative language and frameworks are ill-equipped to provide useful data or perspectives that can inform prevention. And the key word here, prevention. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah. For me, I'm most interested in the characteristics of the perpetrator. And so, as a queer person, I have had close friends of mine who have been victimized by hate crimes and almost lost their lives. And I understand that there's a lot of emotion behind wanting to call something a hate crime. And that's what the femicide movement is really advocating for. But if we don't start talking about what makes someone a killer, and if we don't start talking about the structures that teach the things that lead someone to kill, we're never going to be able to prevent it. And so that's where I'm skeptical of the way that data counting and just counting the women or girls, like, you know, we know that in Quebec, the count is at 18 now this year, which is heartbreaking. But knowing that number doesn't tell us about what are the red flags with folks who are dangerous, how can we prevent it, how can we design programs and interventions that are going to make sure that we don't continue to see a body count where the count keeps going up and up and up. When it comes to domestic homicide, we are looking at like the most predictable, the most preventable form of homicide. The red flags are there, we know it, we have known this now for 25 years, and so there's no good reason why we can't be putting in place the solutions that we need to prevent the loss of life.
So one of the really great things about your book is that it really works to provide an account of violence that takes into consideration colonialism, anti-Blackness, histories and legacies of slavery, of colonialism, and so that's part of a kind of larger Black feminist practice, Indigenous feminist practice. I was rereading for one of my classes, Bell Hooks' All About Love, in which she's also interested in the structural causes of domestic violence. She writes that, quote, replacing the family community with a more privatized, small, autocratic unit helped increase alienation and made abuses of power more possible. It is this dependency that became and is the breeding ground for abuses of power. And so I wanted to ask you about those forms of structural violence that you examine in your book, the legacies of Black feminists and Indigenous feminists and their kind of complex accounts of violence, and the ways that those framings help to understand domestic homicide, helps to understand the connections between state control and intimate terrorism. And then I also wonder if you might maybe share a little bit about how you, as a white person, situate yourself within this body of work.
Yeah, no, thanks for reading that Bell Hooks quote, Natalie. It's, so I consider myself to be a student of Black feminism, a permanent student of Black feminism, and I don't think that I have all the answers on how abolitionist projects should run or how transformative justice should work or should always work. But one thing that I feel is my responsibility as a settler and as a white person who's a student of Black feminism is to do my homework and to do my research. And so, you know, what I encounter all the time talking about intimate partner homicide, especially with white women working in the domestic violence prevention industry, is a lot of surprise about the fact that this is like a historically new crime. So people seem to be very taken aback by the fact that intimate partner homicide is something that emerged through the expansion of colonialism and happened in partnership with the emergence of racial capitalism. And so, you know, I think about taking a historical perspective on those things, because it's one thing to say, okay, well, these forms of severe violence in relationships come from white supremacy, and they were brought here through colonialism. But if you look at the how, if we look at the way in which marriage and chattel laws were set up, it's only a recent historical thing on this territory that women were treated like property. That's a relatively new historical phenomenon. So when we talk about intimate partner homicide, it's really easy to say, well, you know, possessiveness and jealousy and the objectification of women, all of these things are what cause us to be killed at, you know, alarming rates.